Okay, so recently I had a conversation about food with Noam, Aaron and I's 7-year-old son. Food, it's a popular topic for most people, but it's a popular topic in our house. And we've recently started organizing our meals in our week by designating certain dinners on different days around certain categories. You've probably heard of the ever-famous Taco Tuesday. Yes, we have done that one before. But we went through a season this past summer where we ate tacos so often because things were a little tight that no one's like, not tacos again. So we scratched that, 86 did. So currently, our categories sound like stir fry on Stirs Day, stew on Stews Day, and the less creatively named Pizza Wednesday. About 2 weeks ago, with his pointy little chin, that's my chin, pointy little chin resting in my shoulder, Noam was peering at my laptop screen while I was working, and he asked in his sweetest voice, "Mama, what's for dinner?" And I explained it was Mac and Cheese Monday. To which he replied something like, "Oh, goody," and he scampered off to go play with his Legos or something. Only a few minutes later, Noam had tired of his Legos, probably because he was hungry, and he scampered back downstairs to find Aaron and I in the kitchen. So with hungry anticipation, Noam looked at the stovetop at that exact moment when Aaron was pouring the packaged cheese onto the macaroni noodles, and with concern and alarm cried, "What? No!" and threw himself prostrate onto the kitchen floor with no shortage of tears. Mac and cheese, even the dairy-free, gluten-free kind, which I'm very familiar with, is both an amazing staple and comfort food. Its questionable nutritional value is trumped by its necessary prep time and warm, gooey wonderfulness. It's included on kid menus everywhere. It is time-tested and kid-approved. But clearly, Noam disapproved. After he calmed down, rose himself up off the floor and calmed down enough for us to ask him what caused the beloved mac and cheese to fall from grace, he explained that it had the weird kind of cheese. I hear affirmations in the audience. We know what we're talking about here. What I forgot to mention was that this was the second week in a row that Aaron and I had experienced a mac and cheese fail. When we responded to Noam's cheese complaint, we assured him that it was a different brand this week. In fact, it was his favorite brand of mac. His response, "I know it's my favorite kind of mac, but it's the wrong kind of cheese." Our response, we invited him to the dinner table and explained, "Well, maybe you'll like what we make for dinner tomorrow night more. You are welcome to try this mac and cheese, eat as much of it as you want, and you can help yourself to as many vegetables as you like." His response, "I won't have enough to eat." So, as God's children, we are invited to the table. Sometimes, however, when we get there, what we get is not exactly what we want. Sometimes what we get is not familiar. Frankly, sometimes we don't even know what it is. So how can we, when we feel like life is serving us up the wrong kind of cheese, in the midst of the not exactlys and the not enoughs, how can we faithfully practice gratitude? So in Exodus 16, long before mac and cheese was invented, the Israelites shared a similar struggle with practicing gratitude. Let's take a look. But first off, let's establish some backstory. Exodus 16 picks up about 1 month after the end of the Prince of Egypt left off. So it'd been about a month since, the Passover, and God's people had crossed the Red Sea, meaning approximately 30 days since God had parted a body of water so big that it is visible from space, just so his people could cross it to be out of the heavily armed reach of one very put-out Egyptian army. God just did his people a serious solid numerous times. But a mere 1 month later, we hear the Israelites complain in verse 3. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you've brought us in the wilderness to starve us all to death. Okay. For starters, I have a hard time believing that there was much sitting going on at all while the Israelites were being enslaved, let alone sitting around pots filled with meat. And yes, starve to death sounds a little dramatic. But to be fair, the Israelites were taking quite a hike in the Sin Desert, the region in which they were traveling. It was fairly rugged terrain, both hot and mountainous. Now, for that matter, I actually like to go on hikes, in Tucson, which is a desert. But when it's hot, I don't even like walking from my front door to my car. And even when I do go on hikes and it's not blazing hot, I still need breaks. And for me, I know that one of my favorite reasons to take a break while hiking is to eat my snacks. Sweet, salty treats, thus stop moving. It is a win-win. However, the longest that I personally have ever hiked for is 2 days, okay? These guys have hiked for at least 30. So when we find the Israelites at the beginning of Exodus 16, they've hiked the better part of the entire western coast of the Sinai Peninsula, and they are tired, they are hangry, and they are very much without snacks. However, even if the Israelites are sore and they are homesick for a home-cooked meal after a month of hiking, there's also some serious nostalgia going on. Gross generalizations about the good old days back in Egypt when there were pots of meat and endless breadsticks. They make it sound like Olive Garden. I'm pretty sure slavery was not at all like Olive Garden. If you ever find yourself a little like the Israelites and complaining, maybe wistfully thinking about the good old days, back when things were a little different, you might be struggling with your gratitude in the present. And that might be a legitimate struggle. You might be justified there. Maybe, like the Israelites, you're going through a desert season in your life right now. In some respects, maybe circumstances were better. Maybe you did have more money. Maybe you did have more support. Maybe you did have a better job. Maybe you did have a stronger, healthier body, more hair. And options are endless. But while looking backward is natural, it does make it difficult to notice and appreciate what's going on around you right now, even if it is different, or in some respects, less than what you had in the past. I'd also like to point out that their all or nothing black and white thinking is going on here. Granted, our brain's capacity for critical thought is not at its peak performance when we're in physical distress. And the Israelites just did something like the Pacific Crest Trail. But if only the Lord had killed us. Really? There's a really big difference between uncomfortable, even really uncomfortable, and dead. There's also a really big difference between natural death and homicide. There's a whole lot of life in between either of these things and the other, and the Israelites are just not able to see the gray area. Then again, the Israelites demonstrate this extreme kind of thinking at the end of the passage when they accuse Moses and Aaron for bringing them into the desert to starve to death. Yes, this black and white thinking is referring to death again, but this time it's a little different. It's more a judgment about the intentions of their leaders' leadership. Once again, there's a whole lot of wiggle room between let my people go and let my people starve. God's people clearly are having a difficult time in the face of challenge, remaining grateful for the relationships with the people around them. And in all actuality, again, it's not abnormal. When times get tough, when we feel threatened in any way, your brain starts doing different things. I won't go into it, but it's true. It's really easy. The point is, it's really easy to begin thinking that the world is all against you. If you notice right now, if you've noticed lately that your opinion of someone has suddenly suffered an about face, and you suddenly have begun thinking that someone is more insidious than you originally thought, if you're really struggling to see that human character has a whole lot of gray area, you might be suffering to maintain your gratitude in the present, and it's not abnormal. Thankfully, God the Father loves us, whether we are grateful children or not. And good parents hear their children, even if they don't make every request that they give happen. Even if they don't grant every request, they still hear. And in this case, God heard the Israelites complaining to Moses and Aaron. And in the next verse, verse 4, God tells Moses this: look, I'm going to rain down food from heaven for you. Each day, the people can go out and pick up as much food as they need for that day. I will test them in this to see whether or not they will follow my instructions. Honestly, I think that a very strategic response to someone who's stuck in black and white thinking is using an extreme. Hearing that the Israelites were starving to death, God gives them a response that will be a clear contrast to starvation. He's not going to just feed them, here you go. Oh no, he's going to rain down food from heaven. And God makes it clear to Moses that his intentions behind this is to test the Israelite people to see whether or not they're going to believe him at his word. So Moses communicates God's message to the Israelites about how, and I don't know if you've seen it. I have children, thus I see lots of kids' movies, but I can't help thinking of Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs here, that it's going to rain down food from heaven. And in verse 8, there's a specific detail that's added that I think is really important. The Lord will give you meat to eat in the evening and bread to satisfy you in the morning, for he has heard all of your complaints against him. Remember how the Israelites were nostalgic for their pots of meat and endless bread? God heard. He didn't just perk up at the, we're really hungry, but he actually paid attention to the specific craving. Now, I don't know about you, but my love language is gifts. And the thought behind a gift really means a lot to me. One of the reasons why gifts are so meaningful to me is that they're this tangible example. They really show that a person's been listening to me about what's been on my mind and things that I like. So Aaron, my husband, is really good at paying attention to the music that I talk about enjoying. And he likes to surprise me with things like CDs, because I'm old and I still listen to CDs. But he likes to surprise me with the CDs and concert tickets sometimes. And that's kind of like what God is doing here. He is paying attention to the details when his children speak, because he's showing, and it's important to him to show that he is listening. Not that he grants every single request that we give him, but he hears the craving for pots of meat and all-you-can-eat bread. And so it's meat and bread that he promises. So our story picks up in verse 13. That evening, vast numbers of quail, thus the meat, flew in and covered the camp, like covered. And the next morning, the area was wet with dew. When the dew evaporated, a flaky substance as fine as frost blanketed the ground. The Israelites were puzzled when they saw it. What is it? They asked each other. They had no idea what it was. And Moses told them, it is the food that the Lord has given you to eat. Aside from being evidence that God provides, I think that this is proof that God eats sweets. When I imagine what that flaky substance looked like, I imagine phyllo dough, that yummy thin dough that they use to make baklava. Yeah, think about baklava right now. Yeah, start salivating. At the same time, if I were one of those Israelites and I had never seen this amazing flaky substance before, and say I was expecting a downpour of French baguettes, I'd be a little confused too. Honestly, I think that God not only wanted to perhaps introduce his people to the joys of phyllo dough, but also perhaps skirt possible liability issues from unsuspecting Israelites suffering concussions and possible death from bread meteors. But this brings me to what I think is one of the big points of Exodus 16 that I have for you today, and that's this. Sometimes it is really difficult for us to experience gratitude because what we get is not exactly what we expect. In the story I shared earlier, Noam had a difficult time with Mac and Cheese Monday because we served up the wrong kind of cheese. While he was expecting cheese, it was not the cheese he expected. So I can relate to this. In October of 2016, after a whole lot of prayer and a whole lot of thought, Aaron and I began trying to have another child. So when we tried for Noam back in 2010, we pretty much immediately got pregnant, and 9 months later, ta-da, baby magic, there Noam was. We expected it would be easy peasy the second time around too, but it wasn't. Between October 2016 and August 2017, Aaron and I had 6 miscarriages. About 8 weeks after the last miscarriage, we found out that we were pregnant with our little baby that Aaron was holding, and she traveled somewhere. I don't know where she went. But we had our little baby Greta. We experienced a pregnancy. We didn't expect 7 pregnancies, 6 of which would never come to full term. The truth is that the other side of expectation is disappointment. When what we get is different, sometimes very different from what we expect, it's painful. It's disappointing. It can even be scary. Humans tend to be afraid of what they don't know. And it's really hard to appreciate, to be grateful for something when you don't know what it is or what exactly is going on. In the case of the Israelites, when they saw the flaky substance, they didn't even call it bread. They didn't call it anything. Instead, they called out, "What is it? What is it?" Or, in Hebrew, manna. In verse 31, we find out that the Israelites never actually gave the flaky substance a name. Manna literally means, what is it? They didn't give it a name. They gave it a question. On a really deep level, I can appreciate that the Israelites named what God provided for them after their own questioning, their own discomfort. Calling the bread they had wished for manna, what is it, is a daring acknowledgement of their own vulnerability. God gave them bread, but it wasn't exactly the bread they had expected. Just like the Israelites did with manna, we did something similar with Greta's name. Greta means pearl, which is a treasure that comes after a long season of discomfort. Greta's middle name is Morgen, which is the German word for morning, as in dawn or sunrise. So if you put it all together, to us, her name means a treasured new beginning after a long season of discomfort. Sometimes what we get is not exactly what we expect. And it's difficult to be grateful when you're disappointed. So to deal with this, to cultivate our own gratitude, we change our expectations. We change our expectations to expect the uncertain, to expect new beginnings, to expect surprises. That's the first lesson of Exodus 16 that I have for you. The second one emerges in verses 19 and 20. So we already know that God the Father sent bread to his hungry children. Moses gives them clear instructions on how to gather the manna and how much a person can take for each person in their household. And then beginning in verse 19, he gives one more clear instruction. It says, then Moses told them, do not keep any of it until morning. But some of them didn't listen and kept it until morning. Now, I know that this looks like blatant disobedience, and it is. But let's be honest with ourselves here. If we didn't know that Moses had just said, don't save that manna for later, how is what the Israelites doing here any different from any one of us saving our dinner leftovers to eat them for lunch the next day? Seriously. I mean, full disclosure, I shopped at Costco this week, which is an entire store dedicated to getting more than you need at the moment so you can have things for later. One cannot just shop at Costco without having a pantry or a garage or both. Just this week, I bought 2 grocery carts full of stuff. I had to have an associate help me out to my car. True story. Maybe you don't shop at Costco, but how many people in here have bought groceries at a store recently and been asked if they wanted to donate $1 or round up to the next dollar to donate to some organization and then said, nah, I can't today. Me, I've done that. But why? Seriously, why? It's like 37 cents. Or it's $1. $1. Am I that stingy with my money? Yes, sometimes. But why? I know I am not the only person who has saved leftovers. I know I am not the only person in here who has a membership to Costco. I know I am not the only person in this room who struggled to part with 37 cents after buying a whole week's worth of groceries. We are not that different from the Israelites trying to save a little manna for later. But what is it that drives us all toward these kinds of behaviors? In her book, Daring Greatly, which there is a whole stack of them in the back in the DR store, FYI. In her book, Daring Greatly, Brene Brown calls the heart behind these types of behaviors a culture of scarcity. She describes those of us who suffer within this in this way. Whether true or not, that thought of not enough occurs to us automatically. Before we even think to question it or examine it, before we even sit up in bed, before our feet touch the floor, we're already inadequate. We're already behind, already losing, already lacking something. And by the time we go to bed at night, our minds are racing with a litany of the things we didn't get or didn't get done that day. You know, to be fair, the Israelites are only a little over a month out of 400 years of slavery. That's 0.02% of the time they spent in bondage to Egypt. Part of how slavery propagates is entertaining the lie that a person is not as good as another, not as worthy as another, not as human as another. In other words, it's built on the belief that a person is, for whatever reason, not enough. If I believe that I am not enough, that belief will suck the life out of everything I set my mind to. My work is not enough. My talents are not enough. I will not have enough because I will not make enough because I am not good enough for someone to care enough about. Not enough is a black hole. For that reason, after 400 years of slavery and being enculturated to operate under the premise that they were not enough, it's not a surprise that they would think that they weren't good enough to God to care enough about them to give them enough to eat. It makes perfect sense that they would want to save a little manna for later, because if we don't think that we're enough, we can't be vulnerable about it, and we can't reveal our mortal weaknesses. We always have to plan. We got to keep the shield up. We got to keep a leg up on the worst case scenario. We think we have to muscle out our own survival in a dog-eat-dog world because we fear that there's not enough for all of us because there are dogs bigger than us that will get bigger pieces of meat. A lot of us, most of us, maybe all of us, at least have some little backstory of struggle, of trying to survive, of maybe literally not having enough, not being good enough, of not having enough emotional wick or support to sustain us through hard times. And to be honest about it, scarcity thinking and behaviors are really, really tough patterns to break. We see the Israelites as their scarcity mentality emerges a second time in the story to reveal the third and final point that I have to share with you today. In verses 25 through 27, instead of saving leftovers, they go out and get a head start on their ration. But it isn't just any day that they go out to gather said head start. This time, they gather immediately after Moses gives them special instructions on manna rations during the Sabbath, the day of rest. Exodus reads, Moses said, "Eat this food today, for today is a Sabbath day dedicated to the Lord. There will be no food on the ground today. You may gather the food on the 6 days, but on the seventh day, it's the Sabbath. There will be no food on the ground that day." He repeats himself twice. Some of the people went out anyway on the seventh day, but they found no food. For the same reason that they don't need to save their leftovers, the Israelites don't need to gather food on the seventh day. They already have enough. God speaks to Moses about the heart of their scarcity thinking in verse 29, and he says about the Israelites, he says about us, they must realize that the Sabbath is the Lord's gift to you. That's why he gives you a 2-day supply on the 6th day, so that there will be enough for 2 days. On the Sabbath day, you must each stay in your place. Do not go out and pick up food on the 7th day. So the people did not gather any food on the 7th day. The extra rations were a gift to equip God's people to take a much needed break. At the heart of the double rations on the 6th day is not God saying, "I don't think you're good enough to do this." It's not that. It's God saying, "You don't have to do this. You don't have to. I got this." In other words, God is not only asserting that he's in control, but that he has our best interest, our needs in mind. When it comes to our Heavenly Father's children, us, provision isn't in our job description. It's not our problem. Obedience is. Sometimes we struggle with gratitude because we are under the impression that we have to do all the work, figure everything out. And when things happen not exactly the way we planned, and we fear that we're not enough to handle it, we feel disappointed and afraid of ourselves and the people around us. But as Francis Chan says in his book, Forgotten God, it really comes down to trust. Do you trust God when he says no or not in this way to you? Do you still believe he is good and doing what is best? To the Israelites in Exodus 16, this was at the heart of the test. Are we really willing to practice gratitude for a loving Heavenly Father who is committed to providing for us the things we need? Can we trust him enough to stay in our place and show with a courageous act of rest that provision is not my problem, but the Heavenly Father's? We are not so different from the Israelites. There is always at least a little desert, a little sand in our stories. Maybe you came here today and you notice that you've been a little more nostalgic than usual lately, wistfully thinking about the good old days, when you maybe legitimately had it better somehow than you do now. Maybe you've caught yourself missing the gray area in your life and you find yourself stuck in black and white thinking how the people or the circumstances, you are far better or worse off than maybe actually somewhere in the middle. Let me reassure you, it's okay. In fact, it's normal to look back. It's okay to take inventory and do a quality check and acknowledge what's missing or different in your life. But be careful, Be careful in your doing inventory not to ignore the blessings of the present. While God might be shifting the circumstances or the relationships with whom you are familiar or in which you are confident, remember two things. One, much of life is lived in this gray area. Be ready. Be ready for the unexpected. And two, our confidence, our courage does not lie in the circumstances and relationships with which we are familiar. It's not where our confidence comes from. We struggle with gratitude, and that struggle is justified. God made us gloriously complicated. I tell this to people all the time when I sit with them in my office. You are allowed to be complicated. He made us gloriously complicated, able to love him and feel frustrated at the same time. It's okay. And maybe for you, it has been a long slog. Disappointed that life is serving up the wrong kind of cheese, that things are not exactly as you envisioned them, scared that whatever resources or chances you have are not enough to live this life that God's called you to. Here's the good news. Our confidence, our courage, our trust is in God's very specific and tailored love for each and every one of us. In other words, provision is not your problem. He's got this. Your Heavenly Father has set a bountiful table of life right in front of you, just for you, because you, just you, are enough, his child in whom he delights. You aren't just good enough. You're worth all of his effort to provide for your needs. He went to great lengths to provide for you. Long after he provided meat and bread for the Israelites during their time in the desert, he provided his son, Jesus, to die for you. He gave you everything. You are, just as you are, loved. You are, just as you are, enough. You have, just as it is, what you need. Not only that, but if you think that you do not have all that you need, there's no harm in asking. There is no harm in communicating to God about your desires. It won't hurt. There's no harm because you have a Heavenly Father who is truly listening when you ask for something. He pays attention to the cravings. It may feel quiet during the desert times in our lives, but God does not stand silently. Let that thought fill your every action. It will cultivate gratitude. What we started doing with Noam this week to help him cultivate better gratitude for when life gives him the wrong kind of cheese, maybe literally, are what we call random gratefulness checks. This is something that you can do to check yourself too. Throughout the day, at random intervals, we just did it in the car on the way here, either Aaron or I will ask him to name one thing that he's grateful for at that very, very second. So far, a few days in, we've gotten answers like, I'm thankful that I have food to eat, and I'm glad we're spending time together as a family. He said that one last night when we were around playing a board game. It was really sweet. Aaron and I have joined in now. And so far, it's seeming to help all of us adjust our patterns of thinking. Several weeks ago, Ryan talked about patterns of thinking and how important and influential they are. This is a really great way to steer your pattern of thinking back in a more positive direction. The overall attitude in our house since doing these random gratefulness checks in the last week seems to be a little bit better, actually. And I think everyone in the house is grateful for that. What if we operated each day, interacting with our neighbors and loved ones without fear of disappointment, without hoarding for ourselves, without panic for our shortcomings, without an attitude of scarcity? As Aaron and I have learned, Noam too, in acknowledging the sand in our lives, let's not neglect to see the pearls. Now that is a reason for Thanksgiving.